My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications person at the Canadian Psychological Association, and you're listening to our podcast, Mindful. Now, Mindful is recorded from Ottawa, from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and usually includes a participant from another part of Canada, in a place where the traditions of a variety of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people maintain a bond with the land. Today's episode is a little different because I was able to have a talk in person with our guest, and so we were both in Ottawa, where the bonds between the Algonquin people and the environment go back thousands of years. Now, I've never thought to begin Mindful with a land acknowledgement before, mostly because I've never considered this podcast to be something that takes place on the land. It happens through the air, through fiber optic cables, through voice over internet protocols. But even then, a land acknowledgement would still make sense because all of those things, and the voices you hear on this podcast, pass through our natural environment in some way. And it's that environment that we're really talking about. A land acknowledgement isn't only about physical land like the soil and the ground under our feet. It's so much more than that. And I think it's important for us also to remember that land acknowledgements are not an invention of settlers as a way of reconciling our presence on traditional land that was stolen from Indigenous people, but rather, land acknowledgements are a long tradition among Indigenous people themselves, a tradition they have graciously shared with us in the spirit of reconciliation. My guest today is the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Section of the CPA, Kohkom Beverly Keeshig-Soonias, joins Mindful to graciously share some of her own traditions as we explore the true meaning of land acknowledgements.
So, Beverly Keeshig-Soonias, Deshnakas, Niashin Nigming Donjaba, Mina, Ajak, and Totem. So that is my way of introducing myself as an Indigenous person.
Yeah.
So the Beverly is, I think, an old English name.
I think it is, yes.
Yeah, Ali is like where there's grass growing somewhere.
Yeah, yes, in Old England, yeah.
Yeah, so grass, not the kind they sell. And the Bever part is, you're going to find me on a Canadian nickel. So I think it means beaver. So Beaver Valley or Beaver Meadow.
Right.
And Keeshig are my father's people. So my language of origin is Anishinaabe.
Okay.
And Keeshig would mean maybe sky or heaven. Mm-hmm. And then on my mother's side, Najwan. So Najwan would mean he is pretty, she is pretty, it is pretty. So one thing it helps to know about our languages right away is that they're not binary. So when I am speaking to people in my language, I don't have to dance around and keep track of pronouns.
Right.
Because I'm saying the same thing. I'm saying he is pretty, she is pretty, it is pretty by one word.
Yeah.
One kind of phrase. And I like that when I'm talking to young people because I don't have to, they like it too because we don't have to worry about pronouns like in English.
Yes. And I find French even more difficult because French is all pronouns. Everything has an assigned gender. The table, the chair, the door,
Mm-hmm. So the Soonias part are my husband's people. So Soonias is like that metal where the light flashes off of, reflects off of.
Okay.
So when we met Europeans, they had coins and the light would flash off of those. So it's also another way to say little money.
Right.
So Soonias we often use to say money. And then on his mother's side, Watani is the eagle feather that's often used in regalia.
Okay. Yeah.
So not necessarily eagle tail feather, but one of the main feathers. So that is what I said first.
Yeah.
And then I told you Niashin Nigaming Donjaba, which is really, really important because when I talk about where I'm from, I'm not telling you an address or a longitude, latitude. I'm telling you where I come from, the earth.
Right.
I tell you the earth that made me. So when I tell you Niashin Nigaming, I'm expressing this idea that I'm connected to Earth, and she and I have relationship, and she is the one who made me as an individual the way I am, and my community and my culture the way we are.
Right.
Because of that relationship, in every relationship, we respond in a certain way, and we come to know the other member of the relationship, and it's a moving thing. It's always developing. And so my relationship, even with Niashin Nigaming, has never been static. It's always been in motion. It's always been growing in certain ways. So, well, even in my husband's language, he's a Nehio speaker. If you ask someone where they're from, you would literally say, Tante o Chikia. Literally, where is your umbilical cord connected? Where is your belly button attached in the land? So that is how you'd ask them where they're from. So right away, you know that as an Indigenous person, I have a relationship with my land, or I think of land that way.
Right.
I think of who I am based on where my people have been and how we've become who we are. And also, I think of it as ongoing thing, always in motion. So much of what we talk about in our culture is always in motion.
Right.
So because of this motion, it stands to reason that relationships are always changing. Things are always being created, or maybe things are falling apart or dissolved and then being renewed or recreated.
Right.
So that is a concept that I'm telling you right away when I introduce myself. Niashin Nigaming would tell you also, it would give you an image of where I'm from. It would tell you that you're coming across the water, in this case, Lake Huron.
Right.
So let's say you're a brave soul and you've been canoeing across that water. And then you see Niashin Nigaming. You see a piece of land kind of floating on the water, surrounded almost completely by water on three sides.
Okay.
And when you have that image in your mind of that happening, it floating there, you know you're there.
Right.
So that is another way that we talk about the land we're from, where we're from. And as soon as I say that evokes, well, like I said, things in motion, things in a relationship in being. And it also implies for Indigenous people that is a sacred place for me.
Right.
Because of that. My ancestors are buried in that land. My ancestors had relationship with that land. It kind of tells me who I am. It helps me identify who I am. And I have this idea that when my youngsters went through their teen years and they had the invitation, living in an urban center, they had invitations to join gangs probably at times in their life.
Right.
But because gangs know all about identity, they know about, defining who you are, what your role is, how you're valuable, what you can do to be valuable. All of these things that make up identity, they're good at that. But luckily, because my children knew where they're from, knew who they were, knew how their identity was even at that moment becoming, they could turn down that invitation in their own way, right?
Right.
So they didn't need it.
Yeah.
So let me get back. When an Indigenous person tells a story, it's not linear. You kind of go out and talk about another relationship, and then you come back, and then you go another direction, talk about another relationship, and you come back.
That is okay. I did not think we were going to get on to gangs here, but I'm thrilled that we did. I think that's an evocative example, though, right? The sense of belonging, and some groups are very good at that, and some groups are not. And, I think that's a wonderful example.
And then I told you, Achijak Ntotem. So I told you that the crane is my kind of clan totem, my clan symbol.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is another way you were mentioned belonging.
Mm-hmm.
That is another way that tells me how I belong. There are different clan symbols, maybe turtle or bear or snipe, or depends on your clan, right?
Right.
And your tribe. Different tribes have different symbols. Mine is related to Neashin Nigaming because we have a history of our relationship that goes back to time immemorial. And part of that history is about my people making this great migration from the east,
Okay.
from Wabanaki, from the light land. Some people say Abenaki, but Wabanaki we say, the people of the east. And so we migrated in our story toward the west, which is, Ontario, Lake Huron, Lake Superior. And that my particular land, Neashin Nigaming, figures into this story because the crane called the people to migrate.
Okay.
And also, the route was chosen because the people would follow this shell, this migis, we say. It's a kind of a shell that would rise up out of the waters at certain places. And that was kind of the signpost, if you will, or it would tell. And one of them rose up just offshore from where I'm from.
Okay.
So that was part of the route. So any people who have learned about the Great Migration of our people would be familiar with Neashin Nigaming. It's part of the story. It's part of the history. I guess in English they call it myth.
Right.
But to me, it's not myth.
Right.
So it is so much part of my story. So in that little bit I told you, already it's packed with information, right?
That is a lot of information in that story in just an introduction, and that's fantastic. And I think that leads into what we want to talk about here a little, which is this idea of land acknowledgements,
Okay.
why we do them, and what they really signify for the people who we're in theory acknowledging the land for, right? Who are doing it for. And I think one of the things that you mentioned in your story is this idea of ongoing change with your relationship to the land. And I think that's something that gets missed every now and then in land acknowledgements, is that we don't think of it as an ongoing thing. We think of it as something that has happened already in the past. This is traditionally and formerly the land of the Haudenosaunee people or whatever, right? But not that it continues to be. And I think that's a key part. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that's a key part of the way we need to think about land acknowledgements when we do them.
Yeah, for me, in contrast, in speaking English or looking at land from a Western lens, if you will. So I think of us all sitting in a circle in the world, and we're all looking on from different directions. Culture is very, language, culture, everything is very ethnocentric, right? And I think many Euro-Canadians think that if they name a place or put a place on a map, that we all have the same assumptions about it.
Right.
But I find that Euro-Canadian culture sees land as static. You just pointed out. You say a place, that's it. It's a place. They make a map, again, using their own assumptions about, topography or whatever standardizations come into call from Western science to make a map. So they make a map and they say, there, we know the land. But if an Indigenous person, that symbol is very reflective of Western culture. It's very limited. It contains no idea of the history of us, although it might kind of, without Westerners knowing, hint at their history and how they think history played out, right? By the way they make the map or what they named the place. And then there's no idea of relationship in that wording or that map. There's no spirit in that map, like there is when I say Neashin Nigaming. And and it's thought of as kind of static, like I said. Whereas we think of, because everything's in motion, everything has spirit, we think there's so much more to it, right? Especially this idea of relationship, that land generally, Mother Earth, we have a relationship with her. She has spirit.
Right.
And as soon as something has spirit, you start thinking about, oh, what is my part of the relationship? And you start thinking of a certain idea of respect, and start wondering, well, what's my responsibility toward land? Because Indigenous world, we know that land looks after us.
Right.
And we need to look after land, right? Or we're to our peril.
Yes.
But this is an old idea. This is not a current idea among my people.
Well, ongoing idea, I would imagine, right? Yeah.
We have, I dare say, we have always done land acknowledgements.
Right.
My people, like even when I told you where I'm from, there was like a land acknowledgement. I was paying respect to where I come from. I was paying respect for that history that we share. I was paying respect to her spirit and mine. Because remember, I said our language is non-binary. So when I say land, I mean she, he, it, or mostly her, because in English, the feminine seems to evoke more ideas of nurturing and life. And
right, we've created this character of Mother Earth.
Yeah, so when I speak English, I often say her, right? So just to help carry people along with me in what I'm saying in my story. I'm trying to be culturally appropriate here, speaking English. But so this is one I want people to know. We have always done land acknowledgements. And I think that new Canadians, or Canadians have been here many generations, think that it is something new, that they're making us do this, or they're imposing this on us, or this is a requirement. And is it just meant to make us feel guilty?
Right.
You know, and I really want to let people know that is not the case. We have always done this. And we believe because of it, because we're trying to maintain a good relationship with our land, and because she has spirit, there are ethical requirements. You know, we want it to be an ethical relationship with land, that we think if we keep it that way, that it is good for our well-being.
Right.
And I think that this is something that all Canadians can share. If they can come to think of land as alive and with spirit and in good relationship with us and nurturing us, you know, taking care of us even when we're oblivious.
Right.
Just because, you know, the trees give us oxygen all day, every day, doesn't mean they send us a bill on our cell phone every day, you know,
right.
Oxygen.
Yeah.
And we're oblivious to that. We don't think about it, right? And yet we are gifted continually. Or that the trees are taking some of the impurities out of the soil and putting it back in a good way. And,
right.
You know, we don't think of these things often. We're kind of imagine if you were in a relationship with someone and they just ignored you at all times. They seemed indifferent to you.
Yeah.
At all times. The pain of that. It's almost easier if someone hates you, because at least they recognize your existence.
Right.
Whereas indifference is so hard to respond to as a human being. It's so devastating. And I think that is one of the reasons we're asking for the land acknowledgement, is because this indifference has caused harm in the world. For one thing, it made it very easy for Euro-Canadians to take us away from our land.
Right.
To take us to residential schools, or to take us many, many miles and put us on a reservation where we weren't, that was not our original territory. So if we have this close relationship with the land, it would help you imagine how lonely people are for our land.
Right.
That we no longer have access to it, because, again, Euro-Canadians think of land as a commodity, something you can put a fence around and deny people access.
And claim ownership of. Right?
Yes, claim ownership. Like she's a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if your grandmother was in the kitchen cooking and I said to you, is it cooking?
Right.
That would be so shocking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for an Indigenous person, we find that shocking.
Right.
And then, but we realize, I guess it was part of the process. They had to make land a commodity. They had to make land an it in order to separate us that way.
Yeah.
From land.
And so the land acknowledgement that we Eurocentric Canadians, people who've been here for a while, do. Are you saying in a way that you're inviting us in to have the same sort of thought process, at least to try to start having that thought process about the land, that we also should be thinking about the land in the same way, or try to at the very least?
I think so. Not just think about it, not just use, the cognitive ability you have, but let your heart and your spirit, your soul have the same relationship we have, because it contributes to well-being.
Yeah.
We are aware of what has happened to our well-being since we've been separated from the land as Indigenous people, right? And we are aware of how our children are growing up different, being separated from the land, because some of us have come to urban centers,
right?
And our children do not have that same intimate relationship with our land. The other thing, of course, is because of this separation, which has happened somehow systemically by the colonial government, is that, like I said, we're denied access in many times from our own land. And like I said, it has caused kind of a malaise, a loneliness, if you will, a longing,
right?
Feeling like it has affected so many parts of our life, our identity, our spirits. When you have a relationship with land or anyone, part of that relationship, like I said, involves our responsibilities, but the blessings that come from the other part of the relationship, and also gives us a sense of what our ethics, give us a sense of what our values, give us a sense of, maybe hope and confidence in that relationship in our land, right? And I think human beings need that confidence to move forward. They need that faith to move forward. That doesn't really exist in a Euro-Canadian format if you are just thinking of land as just this commodity that we need to, the relationship that many Euro-Canadians have with land is for extraction purposes.
Right.
It started that way and it continues that way. And it makes it easier to do if land is dead, if land is an it, if land doesn't have spirit. So let me get back to your question, sorry. Yes, we're inviting people to have good relationship with the land, because as soon as you do, you have good relationship also with the water, with the air, with the plants that grow in that land, with the four-legged ones on that land, as well as all of the two-legged ones, right?
Right.
Right away, it enriches, it helps that relationship. And part of a relationship is seeking to know and coming to know and coming to maintain a relationship. And we know that we agree with Westerners that if something is static, it's in danger. And the same with the relationship. If it's static, if our relationship happens with the land, we will all be in danger, especially our well-being.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what we're saying. We're also saying that please acknowledge what devastating effect it had separating us from this relationship. Please try and understand that, this loneliness, this identity, in many ways it has affected us. And also that it's going to affect you at some point, non-Indigenous folk. I think many of our allies are becoming aware of that and seeing that it's just not a hokey thing,
Yeah.
Sadly, Western science, and psychology is part of Western science, has spent a lot of time just concentrating on measurement
Right.
Or a measurement for the purpose of controlling an outcome. And it has dismissed spiritual relationship. And
I think one other thing too, and this was just something I was thinking about the other day, is that there's also a sense of an accelerated timeline. I was thinking about a seminar I went to. I went to a little conference here in Ottawa about agroecology. And this was the notion that, Indigenous people lived on the same land for thousands and thousands of years and learned the best practices to, fish and to grow crops. And they would rotate this crop and that crop and so on. And that it was very sustainable, and that relationship with that land created this. Whereas, the farming that we do, Eurocentric sort of farming, tends to favor monocultures and, just plant one thing year after year after year, get as much of a yield as you can out of it, then move on to something else, and which is more destructive for the land in the long run, because we're not really thinking about 100 years from now. We're thinking about what's going to make the most money in the next, 72 days or whatever, right? And so I just think that there's a difference in thinking in terms of timelines there as well.
Yeah, a few things you have mentioned. The people make derogatory remarks about Indigenous people not having a good sense of time. I've even heard this expression, they got there on Indian time. And it's not very kind when it's said. I guess it isn't meant to be kind. But we do think of time, you're right. We do kind of think of time different. It's not linear. We don't talk about, things have to go from A to B to C to D. We often think of time as cycles or repeated patterns that we see in nature, like migration.
Right.
That kind of thing, the animals migrating, the people migrating, those kind of patterns we see, so we think of time more as a process.
Right.
So I read an article one time about a professor in, I think it's Brazil, and he taught Indigenous Brazilian students and he taught Euro-Brazilian students, and made the observation that his Euro-Brazilian students would arrive on the clock, on time. They'd be ready to start the class.
Right.
Sometimes his Indigenous Brazilian students weren't there right on the clock. But his Euro-Brazilian students would leave on the clock too. So if he was in the middle of a sentence, they were gone.
Right.
But he said that his Indigenous students would stay to finish whatever process was happening, whether it was a conversation or him trying to finish explaining a concept, or even what was happening with one of the students in the room at the time. Not necessarily what we would consider academia.
Right.
But it was the person present trying to learn something was happening to them. And he said they would wait. They would let the process finish before they left. And I think we think that way. We get more concentrated on the process. And so that's one thing that came out of what you told me. The other, you reminded me that we're kind of into diversity as Indigenous folks.
Right.
That if you meet Indigenous farmers, say down in the Amazon, they are still growing many, many types of corn. It's not one type. There are many, many types. And they know that's a good thing. I talked to an agricultural scientist one time, and he said, because all of the grains have kind of a single source, think of one virus that goes after it. They're
Right.
doomed because they're all the same. There's no diversity. There's nothing to help them to shore them up, from other
Right.
directions that have other strengths. So our cultures, I should say. I'm sorry, I'm even being ethnocentric because I'm speaking as Anishinaabe instead of, more general. But diversity is something that we treasure, and everyone in the village has their role. They don't have to be, we don't cater to the mean, if you will, like the one type of person.
Right.
That this diversity is celebrated, as part of Well, it's like part of the mandate that comes from our relationship with the land. Seek to understand each plant. They all have their own way of doing things. They all have their own cycle. They all have their own gifts. They all interact with each individual animal differently.
Right.
They all have their own relationship with every animal. They have their own relationship with the air differently, or with the sun. You know, like some plants don't like to be in the direct sun, and some like to be in the shade, and some like it when it's cool, and some like it when it's just blazing away, right? And
That's how I plan my backyard vegetable garden every year. Yeah.
See, that's right. Yeah. So, see all the richness that plants and animals teach us?
Yeah.
They teach us about all these things, you know, and so it's good to be in relationship with Earth.
Yeah, I like the way you describe that, being in a relationship with the earth, because I think it also shines a light in a way on the way we do at a land acknowledgement. We are acknowledging not just that the land that we're currently standing on used to belong to someone who isn't us, but also that it still does, and that it still has, that you're still in a relationship with that land, that this land that we're standing on is a partner to a whole group of people, and we could be part of that group of people if we want to think of the land as a partner ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to talk about it when I speak to new Canadians, especially adolescents are my favorite. You're not supposed to have a favorite, but Oskayak, as we would call them in Cree, new people. I love them, you know, I love their time of their life. And when I talk to them in high schools, I know many of the young people I speak to are new to Canada, or their parents. And they are away from the land of their ancestors. They're away from where their ancestors are buried. They're probably lonely. They're having to adjust, you know. They have children who are running around speaking the language and already having more power than they do. You know, right. Some of them have to have their children go to the grocery store with them to even shop. And so everything is kind of upside down in their relationships, right?
Yeah.
They are not the knowledge holders. They're not the knowledge sharers anymore. So I tell the young people, help your parents and your grandparents develop relationship with the land. Help them become more rooted here. And then maybe they will not be so lonely, and maybe they will help you become part of this land and in relationship with this land.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds kind of, you know, I don't know, just wishful thinking, and it's not great for concrete people to think, like, what are you talking about here? But I find young people, they resonate. It resonates for them. They like to hear it. They want to be helpful with their parents and their grandparents, and they don't want to be marginalized. They want to be part of the land the way we got to be at one time.
Right.
And I think they like to hear that. You know, so it's part of what I like to share with people, because I think it will contribute to well-being.
I think so too. And I think that's one of the big takeaways that I have already, is that, you know, we've talked an awful lot. We just finished doing Psychology Month on climate change and talked about going, you know, people who spend more time outdoors, who spend more time connected with the nature that's around them, more time walking in the woods or digging in the garden or whatever, that they do experience greater well-being, that they're happier as a result. And so, you know, this really is more of that idea. You are increasing well-being by increasing your connection.
Yeah, so that is my hope, that people realize this is part of what we're saying when we talk about land acknowledgement. Also, it is important because it is action. Right. You know, language is so powerful. Language animates things. It gives life to things, right? And, well, mind you, it can kill things the way that language is used. But our language is not just my language, but that of my husband and other tribes. Is everything is alive, like I said. Everything has spirit. And so the places we have named in the past reflected that, or reflected our history with that place, or reflected how it made us be who we are, like I said earlier. And I think that language is important. To say it out loud is to use another part of your body, another part of your brain, another part of your identity, right?
Right.
So I think that's good. And I think because of the TRC, calls to action, this is something that's action.
Right.
You know? And once you have said it as a truth, then you're kind of in a space where you have to decide, how do I respond to this now? I've just said this. I've just acknowledged this is a truth. So how do I ethically respond to this as a human being? How does that influence the way I interact with the land,
Right.
her, and how I interact with these people who are like the stewards of this land, these indigenous folk? Or how do I interact with the knowledge they want to share with me?
Right.
Or their worldview, right? How do I, dismiss it as non-scientific or primitive, or the words that have been used to us, or just something that the other is saying to us? And do I continue on this path, or do I somehow let it be part of, the way I think of myself as part of the world?
And I think if you do dismiss it, if you just say, well, that's somebody else's thing, and that's, the science that I believe doesn't, let me believe this, then you're not really doing a land acknowledgement, right? As such, you're just sort of checking a box. You're just sort of saying the words you think need to be said, or that you think someone is expecting of you, but you haven't really, I think, paid attention to what the whole purpose of it is.
Yeah, I spoke to a group recently, and they were saying, can you come and talk to us with land acknowledgement? I think they were kind of wanting a nice script that was kind of, elder approved or whatever,
Right.
Kohkom approved, and, that they could use. And so I spoke to them about 2.5 hours about land and our relationship, and they kept asking questions. And in the end, unfortunately, I had not produced this script or something that was written down that they could just, look at and use in future. And I was so pleased with the way they responded to what I said. And that the next day I spoke to a social group of Indo-Canadian folks.
Okay.
And they had invited me to a panel on wellness, and they invited me to do the land acknowledgement.
Right.
So I thought, maybe I should just talk to them about why we do these. So that's what I did, because for one thing, the moderator said, and now Beverly Keeshig-Soonias, she's going to do a treaty acknowledgement. I thought, oops. Well, first of all, I don't think I want to talk about a treaty acknowledgement. And second of all, maybe they would like to know why we are doing this. So afterward, many people came up, and talked to me about how it helped them see things, how see it a little bit differently or understand it differently. So that's why I thought I would talk to you all about this today.
And I appreciate that. I do want to make a distinction, though, and I'm hoping you can help me with this. The distinction between a treaty acknowledgement and a land acknowledgement, that doesn't feel like the same thing.
No, to me, a treaty acknowledgement is, so it's something that came after, the cultures met.
Right.
And it is something that treaty was imposed by the colonial government. And so when they talk about treaty areas, like, we did not set those parameters.
Right.
Speaking of a script, the treaty came to us as a script.
Yeah.
Which, of course, we couldn't understand, right? We don't have a written language, and we certainly weren't speaking English before that. And so it was kind of explained by the interpreters. And a lot of the assumptions that were made by those who wrote up the script, the treaty, were very different. Like, first of all, we were talking about our relationship with land, but now it's very imperative that they were thinking about land very differently.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Very differently. So to me, treaty represents the beginning of things like apartheid or reservation life.
Right.
It talks about being denied our relationship with many of the animals we lived with since time immemorial. Like the plains people and the buffalo.
Right.
They couldn't hunt anymore. Instead, they were given rations and told, you need to be domesticated farmers.
Right.
And I use that word on purpose because I think part of the treaty writers, the purpose was to domesticate us. Because before that, we were thought of as wild.
Right.
We think of the land as complete, as perfect. And so it's our job to have, like I said, it's our moral duty to have a relationship with her, understand her, observe, follow patterns, respond to her in an ethical way. But I think the Europeans, when they first came, they talked about it being a wilderness, talked about being savage, and us
they talked
too.
about taming the wilderness a lot.
There's that word. Thank you. Yeah, the need to tame it. And I thought, she was perfect. Tamer, how, and so those assumptions and that thinking, that way of, remember I said language is so powerful?
Yeah.
That way of thinking of land. And so we were considered part of what had to be tamed. So that, I'm sorry, I could talk all day about treaty. I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic, but that's why
okay,
I don't do a treaty acknowledgement. I like to talk about our relationship with land. And I'm hoping that this is helping people.
It's helping me. And I'm the one sitting here right now. So that's...
Miigwech.
I don't know if we've got through all your notes yet. Do you have any other notes, anything specific that you wanted to bring up?
Well, I was at a national elders gathering at the end of October in Amiskwachi. You would call it Edmonton.
Okay, yes.
One of the things the elders talked about is how you'd mentioned the climate and how things are becoming different. The fish taste different. The animals are migrating different.
Yeah.
And even the waters have been redirected by things like dams and things like that, or used on another part of the river.
Right.
And many of the elders are saying they are having trouble with depression.
Right.
Because it's their relationship with land causing this depression.
Because the land is sick?
Yeah. And so it's becoming systemic. It's becoming a big thing. And I wasn't surprised because I have a cousin, she makes, Sky Woman, she makes black ash baskets. So they grow in, North America and parts of Ontario. So they grow actually on the Indian Reserve I'm from.
Right.
And she said to me one day, Beverly, things are well, my family's well, my husband's well, but I haven't been feeling well for the past couple of years. And I said to her, but remember, this bug has been introduced to North America that kills the black ash, and they're telling us the black ash is doomed.
Right.
And I said to her, because of your relationship with the black ash, you're watching someone you're in relationship with dying. Maybe that's why you're getting depressed.
Right.
Maybe. And she said to me, yeah, maybe I need to have ceremony. And I mean, she didn't say a specific one, there's no, what is the expression, silver bullet, but just like there isn't if a friend of ours is dying of cancer or something like that. But we need to have ceremony because our relationship with them is going through transition and we're grieving. And so I think that's what's happening for some of these elders. The same thing that on a lesser scale, maybe with my cousin.
Right.
So these things are not just a lot of mumbo jumbo or the way they were dismissed, even by psychologists at one time, or dismissed as psychosis.
Right.
That these are very real things. And that some of these things need to be attended to in order to, promote wellness.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, but all of this to me ties into our relationship with land and land acknowledgement, even though it seems like I've wandered around.
I think it makes perfect sense. I think
you said before we started recording this that there's just so many things to talk about that you can't just pick one out because they're all interconnected, right? There's a very holistic way of looking at, everything. And I think the same goes here, right? It's a holistic way of looking at all of the environment in which we all live. And to pick out one or two things from that is one, it's sort of difficult, and two, it sort of misses the 98% of all the other stuff, right? I'm wondering, though, just as a psychologist, how does this inform the way you practice psychology? I'm guessing you must do it, incredibly differently from the ones that we've seen on TV,
I guess I do.
Right?
For one thing, I don't have a leather couch in my office where someone sits and talks about their dreams last night while I, file my nails behind my desk. No, it's a little different than, Seinfeld would talk about it.
Right.
Well, I've just dated myself. Anyway,
Hey, I get Seinfeld references. I try not to make them because everyone around here is younger than I am.
Right. They have their own journey.
That's right.
Right. I think part of it is that even if the people I'm meeting, if they're Indigenous, these are some of the things that I want to hear them talk about, even if I don't direct them to talk about it, but I'm listening. I'm listening for hints about their relationship or how they're feeling about that, or whether they even feel, or whether they're just longing for it, or whether they're talking about identity, or whether they're talking about, do I have a purpose? Because an Indigenous person is like, we're packed with purpose. We have so much to do because of this relationship, right?
Yeah.
We have so many relationships to keep track of. We have a network, a sea of relationships, if you will, in our Indigenous worldview. So there's that. There's also even the way a person will come into the room. I like to have our medicines from the land. So I like to have available sweetgrass or sage or cedar or any of those things. So I'm not sure that's part of what a card-carrying psychologist used to have. Maybe they had their assessment, materials present. So there's that. And there's also, I mentioned that I work with young people in the past. I like to work on the land itself, like literally get out of the office, literally be walking on not pavement, but land. So I would spend, luckily, the company I worked for, they allowed me to do this with the young people.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they would have had to, scream and yell and jump around when they're in response to their, what are they, insurance people or liability people? But, in case there happened to be a cougar out there at the same time that I was out there with a youth. But so that would be something I would do different. Also, ceremony is part of, because of our relationship with the land and our awareness of patterns. Renewal is a big theme in our culture. Renewing ceremonies and realizing that if things stay static and we don't renew things, we're in trouble. So a youngster who I met with, he was not allowed to, his brother had taken his life by suicide, but he wasn't allowed to go to the burial ceremony because he was, quote, a flight risk, unquote. So I thought, I have to help this person. So I took tobacco from a staff member who smoked cigarettes at the time. And I went to the backyard with this youth and we had ceremony. And the staff were kind of aghast at what I was doing. They're non-Indigenous, like, well, we're not supposed to let kids who are under 18 have cigarettes, and it's a controlled substance. I thought, ironically, guess how you were introduced to tobacco. But so we did a ceremony, and it didn't mean that I was going to go out in the backyard and spark up with this kid any old random day. It meant that I had to help him do a ceremony because he was denied access to this other ceremony that would have been very communal.
Yes.
And would have been on the land, of course. And in the land, if you will. So that way is different. The other is, I think I don't do a lot of writing, or didn't do a lot of writing. So if I was trying to do assessment with a child, again, looking back at the land, and when we talk about our sense of place, where we're from, we kind of sometimes talk about it from the different cardinal directions, like north, south, east, west.
Yeah.
And we have something called a medicine wheel many people use now. It's a very modern version of ancient medicine wheel.
Okay.
But you can divide it into 4 quadrants, and the young people can see the physical side of themselves, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. You know, and that would be our assessment tool.
Right.
Like, what do you know about these? What do you know how these all have to be well in order for you to have, mino bemadzo, and like a good journey, be well.
Right.
We kind of mean the same thing when we say good journey and being well. It's almost the same word. Well, pretty well.
Yeah.
And so this would be an assessment tool, if you will, that I would give to the child, and they could just take home.
Right.
They wouldn't take home a 30-page document with all of these big words like kablabits or something like that.
I'm
And it would
barely
be
willing
theirs.
to take home a 30-page document from the office.
And it would be there. They could just stick it on the wall and
Yeah.
use it the way they understood it. Because that's another thing. It's not, I know that Western science likes things to be standardized, but
Right.
but in Indigenous world, we realize that everybody has their own relationship with that information I just gave that child, or the information they just gave me. It's unique, right? And I know the Western world likes science to be objective
Right.
and to observe things and maybe boil them down to their smallest common denominator. But in the Indigenous world, we think that's not true. I'm trying to say a nice word. Because we believe we have a relationship with everything, and to deny it is you're somehow losing something in your assessment if you're denying that there's this subjective element to even my relationship with those. You probably heard it in my voice. My relationship with conventional Western assessment material.
Right.
Probably heard it when they said it. And my relationship with the medicine wheel, or
Right,
my relationship with land. I don't know if you heard it, but I love it. I love her.
Yes.
And it's obvious she loves me because I'm still here breathing. And my people, in spite of some pretty rough going in the last few centuries,
Yeah.
are still here.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe have something to offer. So to talk about to young people when I do this psychology thing you talk about, I try to also remember that young people need purpose and they need hope. And luckily, our relationship with land and a land acknowledgement brings out all those things.
Yes.
Of purpose.
Right.
And reason for hope. So.
And I think also acknowledges what you just said, which is that, the stewards of the land have something to offer when it comes to that land. That there's a voice that needs to be a part of so many of these conversations that we have about climate change, about, farming, about all that kind of stuff, but also in boardrooms and in, our day-to-day lives and in scientific pursuits, right?
Mm-hmm. And, psychology is a brand new institution in my culture, but it doesn't mean it didn't exist. So
Right.
like you said, if I practice in the Indigenous way, then it is these things.
Right.
Land acknowledgement and ceremony and renewal and talking about our ethics as human beings to the land and to each other.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I guess, how I'd be a little bit different as a practitioner. Also, I wouldn't talk about so much about dividing things between natural and supernatural, because to us, everything was natural. We didn't have that division.
Right.
And also, like Western culture, we didn't divide things into sacred and secular. Everything was sacred.
Yes.
But that's a whole nother topic. So maybe I will leave it with this, because I think this is lots to think about.
We will leave it there, and we'll think more about this in the days and years to come. I will have Kohkom Beverly back on Mindful to further this discussion as we explore Indigenous ways of knowing and the relationship between the relatively new science of psychology with the much, much older traditions and experiences that have shaped those who were here long before most of us. Thanks to Kohkom Beverly for sharing her thoughts, her insights, and her cultural learnings with me and with us. And thanks to you at home for listening, streaming, and downloading and sharing today's episode. Mindful is written, recorded, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Jamie Montgomery is our editor and producer, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.